What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Mafia podcast, NBA edition. Right now, we are in the middle of our NBA mini series where we're previewing each and every roster, giving you a recap of last season, going over their depth chart, upcoming free agents, and their off-season needs. So my name is Jordan Jike, aka Dr. Fantasy, and I am here with the Fantasy Caveman. Right now, we are going through the teams that were eliminated in the bubble. So today, we're going to be talking about the San Antonio Spurs. Personally, the team that I followed throughout my lifetime. As everybody knows, their 22-year playoff streak ended. I mean, that's most of my life. And, that's one of the biggest reasons a lot of my family members grew up watching the Spurs, and we watched their successful runs, and we would have parties to watch them in the finals. But I don't know if we're going to be witnessing any of that anytime soon. I think they're kind of in rebuild mode right now. But overall, it was a solid season for them, considering their roster. They had injuries, obviously, with LaMarcus Aldridge, but overall, considering the roster that they have, I think that if they did make the playoffs, I've said this a few times, but this would have been Greg Popovich's finest work, because this is probably the weakest roster he's ever had as the head coach of the Spurs. I think that's the reality. So
Yeah.
they finished 32 and 39, the 11th seed in the Western Conference, but they were only 1.5 games out of a playoff spot, and they were really in it until the final 2 games. So I know I was saying, it could be the Spurs and Suns in that playing game, and the Blazers and Grizzlies. Well, the Grizzlies held on. The Blazers kind of launched themselves into that conversation, but they were right into it. So going over some of their season leaders from last year, DeMar DeRozan led the team with 22.1 points. LaMarcus Aldridge, in his limited number of games played, averaged 18.9 points. Then after that, you start to get into a lot of their bench guys, and that's really the theme that we'll talk about with their depth chart. But Patty Mills had 11.6 points, Derek White 11.3, Bryn Forbes 11.2, DeJounte Murray almost 11 points, Rudy Gay almost 11 points. I mean, you see, they just have a ton of guys that average double digits. I mean, that's it's the first time in a while they really haven't had a legitimate Hall of Fame superstar kind of player. They went right from David Robinson to Duncan to Kawhi, and they're kind of in a different situation now. So LaMarcus Aldridge led the team in rebounds with 7.4. After that, once again, it's just a cluster. DeJounte Murray with 5.8. Trey Lyles with 5.7, Jacob Poltel with 5.7, DeRozan with 5.5, Rudy Gay with almost 5.5. So just lots of guys kind of hovering around each other. This is team basketball, baby. I know your Rockets don't know what that is, but this is team basketball. Let's see. Murray led the way with 1.7 steals, DeRozan with 1, blocks Aldridge with 1.6, Poltel with 1.4. Any guys specifically that stood out to you on the Spurs roster this year?
Yeah. Obviously, with your team, I'll let you kind of. You might have some different thoughts than me, but I think the one guy out of everybody has to be DeJounte Murray. I think you kind of coming off a season, in 2018 where kind of his season got cut short because of the ACL injury. You're kind of questioning what you were going to get out of Murray this year coming back. And I'll say this, he looked like the prototypical Spurs player. Like obviously he only averaged around 11 points a game, which is fine, but he looked very well. He looked very solid in his role as a Spurs player. Like I said, he averaged 11 points, 6 rebounds, around 4 assists. And I just think he really, there's not real. He just looked like a Spurs player. Like he looks like the guy you want as a point guard of the San Antonio Spurs. Mm-hmm. Like that's what I have to say. What was your thoughts on? Because I'm curious as a Spurs fan, what did you think of what you saw out of DeJounte Murray this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the consensus among everybody is that he took that next step forward. And, he's still young. I think he's only 23 right now. So he can continue to develop. But the big thing, I think, as the Spurs point guard is he was one of the best on ball guard defenders in the entire league. And that's where he really thrives. So, I mean, he's going to be a staple there for quite a long while, I'm assuming, unless they lose him for some crazy reason. But I really think that he's going to be a staple there. They signed him. He's still there another 4 seasons, so he already got an extension around 15 million a season, which seems like a lot, but in today's NBA, that's kind of the going rate right now. So I don't think it's a bad deal for him. But besides that, they just have a lot of youth. I think one of the big things I was disappointed with the Spurs this season is I mentioned they're in rebuild mode, and I don't think that Pop played the young guys enough. Because when you think about their first round picks over the last few seasons, we really haven't even seen Lonnie Walker yet, who they took in the first round, Keldon Johnson out of Kentucky. These are guys that started to play quite a bit in the bubble, but before that, they really had no role on this roster. And I was kind of disappointed because I understand. I mean, you knew early on Pop was still trying to win. So Lonnie Walker and Keldon Johnson are probably not ready to contribute to a playoff team yet. But realistically, you spent a first round pick on these guys. You need to see what they have because your rebuild is going to look a lot different if they missed on those 2 first round picks and if they miss on this one this year. They're really going to have to bank on some of those guys taking the next step forward. And they hit on Kawhi in the middle of the first round, so it's not like you can't find talent in that range. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, I mentioned the stats, but that's really how the Spurs played. If you wanted to talk about individuals that really impressed, honestly, there's not many individual guys that stand out. That's just the
It's
way
the
that this
Spurs.
team is constructed, I
That's
mean,
that's the thing. You're not really gonna have guys that stand out because that's just not. That's not the Spurs. Like, there's not gonna be. I mean, I'm kind of surprised DeRozan averaged 22 a game. Like that doesn't. But I mean, kind of, kind of a sad state of the Spurs when DeRozan is like the only guy you can truly rely on for scoring, which not the greatest situation to be in, I would say, but yeah, that's why I think. I mean, that's why like DeJounte Murray's the only guy I have down and even then it's not like he just did his job. Like that's just everybody else. A lot of other people they just did their job. That's just the Spurs. That's why you see you kind of talking about the. That's why you see the Greg Popovich is I think he's very similar to Bill Belichick of the Patriots. They just kind of, you know, they like their guys a certain way and just doing their job, and I just think that's why like really no other individuals kind of like stand out at all. So.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, DeRozan had a great season. I mean, he averaged 22 points. He had he had 5.5 assists, about 5.5 rebounds. So I mean, he had a great season individually, and they do need that because you think of the Spurs ways, but there's still superstars that play in the mold of a Spurs player. Obviously, we saw it with Tony Parker and Tim Duncan. Kawhi played that way on the court. I don't know. It sounds like off the court. Maybe he wasn't a Spurs kind of guy. I don't, there's a lot behind the scenes that I'm assuming we didn't see there. But that's the problem right now is it's similar to the Kings when I look at it. And the Spurs are built better than I think the Kings at this point. But they need firepower. And I'll talk about that later with some potential targets. But, when you look at their line, I mean, they're deep. I'll go into their depth chart a little bit right now. I mean, that's they go legitimately 13 deep. When you look at a lot of their box scores, they played anywhere between 10 and 13 players a game, and a lot of them were getting it's not like they played 5 minutes. I mean, they had 10 to 13 guys playing 20 minutes a game. So looking at the point, they had DeJounte Murray, who we've already mentioned. Behind him, they have Derek White, who started at the 2 but came off the bench. So, I mean, they didn't even have a consistent starting lineup. It changed almost every single game, so it was pretty fluid. But Patty Mills is one of the best point guard bench pieces in the entire league, and that's true because he's getting paid a decent amount right now at 13 million, but he's been an important piece for them off of the bench. Bryn Forbes as well. At the 2, they have Derek White, Patty Mills behind him, Bryn Forbes. At the 3, Lonnie Walker was starting during the bubble, which was finally nice to see. And then they also had Marco Bellinelli behind him and Keldon Johnson. Keldon Johnson started to play some tough minutes in the bubble as well. I was actually really encouraged with Keldon Johnson.
Yeah.
I hope that he starts at the 2 for them next season. And like I said, he was a first-round pick, and give the guy a chance to prove why he was a first-round pick. I don't know if he started a limited number of games. I don't think he started a game until the bubble, so he really hasn't been given that opportunity yet. But Derek White's just a role player, so there's no issues in moving him to the bench and starting Johnson at the 2. So I'd be excited for that. DeRozan was playing the 4. They did have the good old veteran Rudy Gay coming off the bench. Trey Lyles, who was a solid bench man. Lucas Semantic, who they took. I'm interested to see if his role increases. Don't know a lot about him, but he seems like one of those typical European players that the Spurs really like. So I'll be interested to see if he gains any playing time. Then at the 5, their depth was really tested this season with LaMarcus Aldridge not playing, but Jacob Poltel stepped in. He's a fantastic traditional big man at the 5, plays fantastic defense. Tyler Zeller, Drew Ebanks, who they also had. So just a lot of depth, and I'm not even being dramatic when I say this team goes 10 to 13 deep because that's the way that they played this season. And I'll kind of tie this together with some of their free agents this upcoming off season.
Yeah.
The biggest one that I'll let you talk about a little bit, DeMar DeRozan has a player option for over $27 million. That'll be an interesting situation to monitor. Besides that, actually, they have a lot of guys under contract as of right now for next season. Bellinelli is also a free agent, and it's a matter, Bellinelli and the Spurs always come together. So it's just a matter if he wants to retire or not, in my opinion. If he wants to keep playing, the Spurs will give him, $5 million a year. I mean, that's just what it seems like they always come to terms with after debating it. Jacob Potel is also a free agent. I think that they need to retain him. He's really important for their defense kind of revolves around a strong big man, and he kind of fits that mold coming off the bench. I don't necessarily want him in the starting lineup, but I think he's an important depth piece. And then you also have Bryn Forbes, who I mentioned, not as important. He was really their 3rd or 4th guard off the bench. Then they had a few guys that played towards the end of the season, and Drew Eubanks and Quindry Weatherspoon. So I'll let you, any notes on the free agency here? And I'm assuming you'll want to talk about DeRozan a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's the biggest one. I mean, I really like DeRozan. I think he's he actually as the season progressed started to shoot a little bit more from 3. I mean, I think maybe because of necessity, because the Spurs, and we know this, that Popovich really hasn't really adjusted to the game, and I think they saw something like 26th very much near the bottom in 3-point attempts. But yeah, like his player option for 27.8. That's going to be a very interesting situation because if he declines that player option and tests and goes to the market, kind of leaves the Spurs in a very interesting situation of how they proceed. Because that means that's your leading scorer gone, and you kind of, even though I don't think he fits the ideal Spurs mold, I think for the way the NBA is going today and how Popovich needs to adjust, which it's not fair for Popovich to have to adjust. He should be able to keep doing his thing and they should still be able to win. But based on how the NBA is going today, I think DeRozan is a player they actually need. But I don't. He didn't seem very. Reports are he wasn't very happy. with the Spurs last season. So like you said, I think he could just end up declining and try to take a little bit less money per year overall to get that security. Jacob Potel, who you mentioned they should keep, is a restricted free agent. So he get a very solid season for him, and he's a guy who I'm interested to see what kind of offer sheet he gets on the open market. I mean, the NBA has been going away from the traditional center, so to speak. So it'll be interesting if he gets a decent offer sheet. The Spurs aren't the type of like DeRozan was such a weird guy for them to go and get from the beginning. So I don't think for a guy that I put out, if some team sides into some weird offer sheet, which we've seen happen with a ton of guys, I think there's definitely a situation where you could see Jacob Polo not be with the Spurs next season. I'd be kind of surprised, but and then the other guys you mentioned, Drew Eubanks restricted, Quindary Witherspoon, who I actually don't think I know a thing about. Other than that, he's a restricted free agent for him. But Drew Eubanks I saw in a couple games, and I was like, I didn't hate him. He looked like he was very solid for him. So we'll see.
He started some games in the bubble, actually.
Exactly. Yeah, that's probably how I seen him. But I personally think they need DeRozan next season. But if I can very possibly see him declining that option. And then and I mentioned this to you before, but if DeRozan declines his option and LaMarcus Aldridge, and they find a way to unload LaMarcus, at this point with LaMarcus Aldridge, you're basically trying to unload the contract at this point. And that's sad to say, but that's kind of where it's where the point they're at now. But if they're able to not have either one of those guys on the roster next year, then you're looking at a team with the Spurs with a lot of cap space, which would definitely make things interesting. I think Popovich is a coach that, I think I could see some guys wanting to play for him. We already met. We didn't even bring this up yet, but we had a thing on the hotspot that I posted yesterday of the Nets apparently wanting to pursue Popovich because Kevin Durant's a fan of him. Very, very quickly, what do you I know you kind of touched on it on the post, but just it doesn't seems like it'd be very fitting to talk about it here, being is that this is the Spurs episode and we're talking about Greg Popovich, who one of the best coaches to ever coach here. What do you think of that situation there of the Nets actively trying to pursue Greg Popovich?
I mean, to me, if Greg Popovich left to go to the Nets, that means he's ring chasing and he's recognizing that the Spurs are in a complete rebuild. And I just don't see him doing that. I mean, another big piece of it, which I didn't really touch on in that post, was Greg Popovich, as much as he seems like a pretty quiet, laid back guy. And you mentioned it, this is similar to Bill Belichick. He wants control of the organization too. I mean, as much as the Spurs have a strong scouting department, and you've seen that with all their international success they've had over the past 20 years, I mean, the reality is that Greg Popovich wants to construct his roster, and at this point, he wouldn't be able to do that with the Nets. He's going to have to inherit that roster and really deal with what they have, because I don't see the Nets reconstructing that roster for Pop, and they really can't because they have big commitments to Kyrie and Durant, and they have all these young guys under contract. So I think it would be hard for him to build the team in his own way if he went there. But I mean, I think he's in a weird situation because I know he does not want to leave after ruining that playoff streak. But at the same time, I mean, it almost makes sense to me just because they and you kind of mentioned it in passing. The game has passed him by, which sounds a little harsh to say, but it's really evolved. And he said before in interviews that he doesn't want to change the way that he coaches. And I understand that, but it's going to be hard because I think you can balance what he does with how the NBA has evolved. We're not saying he has to go out there and be built like the Rockets, but I mean, the reality is that you do need
Oh
some
God, can you imagine?
shooters in today's NBA. I know one of the big.
Imagine the Spurs
Oh,
just
gosh.
going out there and chucking up threes like they're the Rockets.
They will never do that under Greg Popovich. It'll be a whole nother story. I really think that Becky Hammon's going to be their next head coach.
Oh
She's
yeah,
actually come up in discussions for other teams, but the Spurs have always, and I know they're kind of behind the times now, but they were known for being a progressive, different kind of organization for the past 20 years. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was their next evolution, would be hiring the first female head coach. And I wouldn't mind it, honestly. I respect her. She's worked under Pop for a few years now. So I
yeah,
think she kind of knows how this team is built and how to run an organization. But for me, the biggest trend with these they actually don't have a ton of free agents. I mean, really, Potel, Bellinelli, and they have to decide what's going on with DeRozan here. But besides that, I mean, it's probably going to be the same team, but for next season. But they really need to decide if this is a rebuild or if they're trying to win now. Because if they're trying to rebuild, they need to trade DeRozan before he opts out of that contract, and they need to pick up some young pieces. LaMarcus Aldridge is 35 years old.
yeah.
They need to try to dump that contract, get whatever you can. I don't care if it's a second-round pick, honestly. I mean, get literally what. I mean, they'll get more than that, but I mean, literally get whatever you can out of that contract because they really need to be focused on rebuilding this team. I don't see them adding anybody where they'll compete for a championship next season. I can't think of one superstar that would be signing with them this offseason. And then it's interesting when you mentioned they have the ninth highest salary or team salary heading into next season. But when you look at 2021, 22, they only have four guys under contract. And it's all guys that they've taken early. So it's DeJounte Murray, who they extended. And then their first round picks, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson, and then Lucas Semantic, who I also mentioned. Those are their only four guys under contract the year after. So, I mean, it's setting up where they can do a complete rebuild. I'm not sure what the free agent class looks like in 2021, 22, but they'll have a ton of space to go out and recruit guys. So that could be a big season for them. But I'm interested to see what they do this offseason. They can either decide, okay, we're rebuilding this for the long haul, or maybe they're eyeing something bigger. Maybe they're going to go through the motions this season, add a few pieces, compete for a playoff spot in the West. Because as long as Pop is there, the reality is they'll compete at least for the 8th seed in the West.
Yeah.
Even though the West is heavy, I mean, he will coach his way to at least be competitive. So, but it'll be interesting. I could see them going in that direction, just signing a few pieces, being competitive this season, and then maybe they have something bigger eye for 21, 22. But I really think they need to rebuild this year. And then if they struggle, I mean, they could have the Imani Bates Prize coming up fairly soon. So, I mean, that would just be exactly how it works for the Spurs because it seems like every time their dynasty comes to an end, they get the first overall pick, which you saw with Tim Duncan at the end of David Robinson's career. So I think it'll be interesting to monitor. But in my opinion, they need to completely rebuild. And I'll go into their offseason needs. It's similar to the Kings. They just need more firepower, in my opinion, offensive firepower. You mentioned the three-point shooting. They made the second fewest three-pointers in the entire league last year. And not because they weren't efficient. I believe they were third in the league, or second in the league in three-point shooting percentage. So they were very efficient, which doesn't surprise you, being that it's the Spurs. But they just didn't make a lot of three-pointers, and their offense really struggled this season for most of the season. So I think they need more firepower. When you look at their wings, I mentioned Derek White. He's a definition of a bench guard. That's a guy that shouldn't be in your starting lineup, in my opinion. So I like their big guy depth, especially with Rudy Gay under contract. Trey Lyles actually has an option too that I think he's going to pick up. But if they retain Potel, Zeller, Eubanks, Semantic is another young guy. Like I said, I want to see him play a little bit, but they have a lot of depth at the big guy position, so I don't think they need to address that unless they lose Aldridge. But I just think they need some firepower. It's a perfect example of I talked about Cole Anthony in the last episode. I would love if they drafted Cole Anthony, and I know he's not exactly the prototypical Spurs player, but he's a guy that he has some offensive punch, and I know his metrics he struggled a little bit at North Carolina with his efficiency, but I think that's the kind of guy, if you put him under Greg Popovich and his coaching, I think Cole Anthony would thrive and would become a superstar in that situation. So I'd love to see, and not to mention Murray's a very strong point guard. He's more of a facilitating point guard, so you'd be able to play Cole Anthony off the ball, and I think that's the firepower they need to take a chance on. They don't need more depth guys. That's a reality of it. They have enough. I also wouldn't mind if they drafted Aaron Nesmith. You know, that's my boy, the best shooter in this draft. They need some three-point shooting and some scoring, but Aaron Nesmith does play pretty solid defense as well, and he's a very unselfish player. And it's funny, when you look at his scouting report, it's like he was written to be a Spur, because it's like they say he's too unselfish at times, where he always likes to make the extra pass, and he waits for the perfect shot. So, I think he'd fit in really well there. I wouldn't be surprised if they went in that direction, and that wouldn't be a pick that I mind as well. In the international route, they have Denny Avagis, who we haven't gotten to talk about him a lot, but a lot of people are saying he could be Luka-like, so I'm interested to see where he lands. He probably won't be there when the Spurs pick, but he's a guy just with the Spurs international ties that it's kind of interesting to monitor. Then I'll mention 3 free agents, and I'll let you say who you think they should target and what you think they need to look at. But Bogdanovic, who we mentioned in the last episode with the Kings, I could see the Spurs going after him. I think he's a solid defensive player, a team player, a guy that would fit in well. Jeremy Grant, who I've mentioned several times with the Nuggets, very strong defender. He can shoot the 3, so he would help him in that regard, but just seems like a Spurs player. And then kind of a guy that
I said under my notes for Jeremy Grant, fits Spurs mold.
Yep. And I think they need some players that can break that mold, but if they're looking for more depth because they lose Putel or Bellinelli even, I think that Jeremy Grant's a good replacement. And then the last one, I actually have seen some rumors about this, that the Pistons may be looking to trade Christian Wood, who's a free agent, and they're looking at potentially not re-signing him long term, so they're looking at a big deal, or trying to get pieces, because Christian Wood looked really good. I think that'd be dumb on the Pistons' part, because Christian Wood looked really freaking good. But I would love if the Spurs traded. We talked about, I actually saw this in a rumor. I was like, man, I would love that. If they traded DeRozan to somehow turn that into Christian Wood, I would be a big fan of that move.
Yeah, that just, for the Pistons, doesn't make any sense.
It's dumb, but yeah, that's what they're saying now, is that the Pistons want to win now, and they don't know if Christian Wood's a part of that. And I'm like, all right.
What if they get rid of who they have to win now? They're just dumb. But, yeah, like I said, Aaron Nesmith is a guy I had down as well for a draft target here. And I also had Jeremy Grant down. I think this would probably only be able to happen if they shed the salary by DeRozan declining his option and trading Aldridge. But I think Joe Harris.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and he's obviously he led the league in 3-point percentage this season. Very unselfish player. I think he could really thrive under that system, and at the same time kind of give them 3-point shooting that they desperately need to try to be competitive in the league today. And I think that probably, with the contract, Joe Harris is gonna get a really big he probably won't get a max contract, but it's probably gonna be over $20 million. So that's probably only possible for the Spurs if DeRozan leaves and they're able to unload Aldridge's contract, but that could be interesting. And a possible draft target that they're gonna. This is a guy who you really like. What do you think about the Spurs spending their late second round pick on Marcus Howard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that'd be interesting. I mentioned scoring punch. I mean, Marcus Howard will give you a scoring punch. His defense is, I mean, if there's a guy, I think number one, Marcus Howard needs to play off the ball. Given his size, that's not ideal for him, but he struggled with his decision making and made some poor decisions with the ball in his hand at Marquette. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind it from a scoring punch perspective, and I think they could make up for him as a defensive liability with all their strong defenders that they have around him.
Yeah, that's kind of a guy he's a guy who you'll probably they might not even have to draft him.
Yeah.
At this point, I've seen some reports say Marcus Howard could be drafted in the late second. Other reports saying he's not. So I think with Marcus Howard, it's a very interesting talking about a draft. Like nobody has any clue whether this guy's going to get drafted or not. He could very well get drafted in the late second round. He could very well not get drafted. But I just think, in terms of just 3-point shooting, I think it's a big thing. And Marcus Howard is very, very quietly is going to be one of the best 3-point shooters in this draft class. Just look at shot 40. Almost 43% from 3-point range last season for Marquette, and I scored 27 a game. So I do agree that Marcus Howard needs to play off the ball, and his size, he's what, 5'10", 5'11",
Right around there.
very small. So kind of makes it rough, which that's so unfair. I think that's his size is the only reason that he might not get drafted. That's literally the only reason. Like, you got a bunch of other guys that are a couple inches taller that Marcus Howard brings exactly the same skill set as some of these other guys, but the only difference is Marcus Howard's 3 or 4 inches shorter. That's literally the only reason that I could think of as why he might not get drafted, and that's a shame. But I just think he's a guy who the Spurs taking a chance on him with the 2nd round pick. Not the worst idea in the world.
Yeah, I would agree. So looking forward, let's see where we can see him finishing next year. We've talked about the Western Conference quite a bit, but it's a very, very deep conference.
Yeah.
You can make an argument for almost every single team making the playoffs. We mentioned in the last episode, but I think it'll be tough for the Kings too. The Spurs at this very moment, I think it's almost impossible to project where they're going to be next season.
Yeah.
Because we have no idea what their roster is going to look like. If they retain everybody and they still have Aldridge, if DeRozan picks up his player option with all this depth and all this youth, they'll probably compete to be the 7th or 8th seed in the West.
Yeah.
And I only say that because based on the roster, you'd laugh at that. But based on Greg Popovich and the way that he's coached, I mean, him by himself will keep this team competitive as long as they have that roster. Now, if it's full rebuild and they get rid of DeRozan, trade Aldridge, and it's just a complete youth movement, then you're going to see them at the bottom of this conference. And realistically, they're probably eyeing someone already in next year's draft if that's what they're planning on doing. Yeah. But I think overall, it could go either way, honestly. They won't be competing for a championship. I can't see them making big enough moves for that, but they'll be competitive with this roster. And if not, it's full rebuild mode, and we'll go back to hopefully a new dynasty.
Yeah, that's the very interesting. I don't think Greg Popovich is going to have any part of a full rebuild at this stage.
Yeah.
He's I think he's like 71 now. Like, he's definitely not a spring chicken anymore. But I think that's gonna be interesting. If Greg Popovich comes back next year, which all reports are that I think that he's probably going to.
Mm-hmm.
Be very surprised if he doesn't. I don't think the Spurs are going into a rebuild. I think they're gonna try to retool, so to say, just kind of reload and kind of give it another run at, a possible playoff berth. Which, yeah, I don't want to see Greg Popovich being a coach of a rebuild. He doesn't. I don't think he doesn't deserve that. He deserves to be on a. He deserves to coach the team and have a chance at making the playoffs and a championship. But which is partly why the reason I think with no matter. I personally I would like to see Popovich retire. It'd be sad, but I think the way the game's being played now, the current construction of the Spurs roster, even if Popovich wants to continue and try to win now I don't even think Popovich can really do anything that would make this team truly competitive, which is kind of where we're at. So I'm with you. They could very well compete with the same roster intact. They could very well compete for a 7th, 8th seed in the West, but there's so many other teams that on paper are better and are younger. Like you mentioned, like the Suns, like the Timberwolves even, I think. I don't want to say they're gonna miss the playoffs if Popovich is back, because that sounds so disrespectful. That sounds so disrespectful to say a Popovich team won't make the playoffs. I mean, obviously their streak ended this year, but I think next season be a new season, and I wouldn't count it out. But I don't see them making the playoffs next year if Popovich is back. So kind of
it'll be tough.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, I think that's everything that we have for the Spurs. So we appreciate everybody for listening. We'll be going through the last two teams that missed out on the playoffs in the bubble, which will be the Grizzlies and Suns in the upcoming week here. So make sure you stay tuned for that. If you don't already, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Fantasy Mafia. Check us out on Facebook. Keep the conversation going in our group, the Fantasy Hotspot, which is for you guys to just go in there and talk some sports with one another. Doesn't have to just be fantasy football. I know that's the trendy one right now, but go in there and talk about the NHL, the NBA, MLB.
Don't talk about the NHL. Nobody wants to hear about that.
Nobody likes that crap, but if you want to talk about it, I'll allow it. But we appreciate you guys watching, appreciate the support, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yep.